This morning, Egypt voted, but could the Arab Spring prove the very perils of democracy? Plus, the president's spending spree that wasn't. Try telling the U.S. auto industry that this administration spends too much. And how is it that the mayor of the nation's 68th largest city commands such national attention? But first, how can we possibly find the answers to America's education problems if we're not even asking the right questions? Good morning. I'm Melissa Harris Perry. Now, I want to start this morning by thanking my hosts and the graduates of the all-women's college, Wellesley, where yesterday I had the privilege and high honor of delivering this year's commencement address. And while I provided those graduates with some words of wisdom as they go forth into the recession economy they face, I also willed them to take note that the degree they received confers on them significant privilege. The privilege of an elite education opens doors to more than employment and income. More education means better health. It means greater civic participation. It means more esteem and influence. But quality education is not equally accessible, and neither are the privileges that go along with it. Those Wellesley women are the success stories of our national education system, a system that is imperfect at best and a failure for the majority at its worst. So I was initially pleased to hear that Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney was addressing similar concerns about education during his speech to the Latino Coalition's annual summit.
Here we are in the most prosperous nation on earth, but millions of our kids are getting a third world education. And America's minority children suffer the most. This is the civil rights issue of our era, and it's the greatest challenge of our time.
Listen up, because you may not hear me say this often. On this one narrow point, Mitt Romney is right. Education is the civil rights issue of our era, but only if you extend our era back about 200 years. You see, throughout the 19th century, Southern states made it illegal to teach slaves to read. In the 1840s, Irish immigrants struggled to maintain control of their kids' education so they wouldn't be overly influenced by Protestantism. And in 1864, the U.S. Congress made it illegal to teach American Indian children in their own native languages. Education has long been the terrain of inequality and social control. So yes, Mr. Romney, indeed, education is the civil rights issue of our time. It's the greatest challenge of all time. Public education is one of the most important achievements of the Reconstruction era. The South's first system of public education sought to bring thousands of newly freed slaves into civil society, equipping them with the tools they needed to engage in public life. And in doing so, it actually created a system that provided poor white children in the rural South with their first opportunities for literacy. You see, public education is the glue that holds our democratic process together. It is the engine of social mobility. It is the way that we actualize the American dream. Or at least it's supposed to work that way. Unfortunately, the public in public education is endangered by the policies advocated by Mitt Romney. He and others use the language of school choice, but choice too often means using public funds for private schools. It means pitting the interests of teachers against the interests of students. It means stripping the choice of music, art, and sports in order to focus solely on rote skills that can be tested and measured. Romney calls for reforming education funding to encourage more charter schools and vouchers for poor and disabled students to take federal dollars to their school of their choosing. And choice sounds so good, but not every student can simply choose their way to a better education. Romney has spent 35 pages outlining for us an answer. But it seems to me he hasn't even asked the right questions. Among my guests this morning, Lila Leff, founder of Chicago's Umoja Student Development Corporation. She spent the past 22 years working on the front lines of urban education, engaging with thousands of underserved and minority students. Also at the table, Philadelphia City Paper and Salon.com reporter Daniel Denver, who has been covering the biggest ongoing education story in the nation. Thanks to both of you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
So here's Mitt Romney. He shows up in Philadelphia in the middle of quite a fight going on there and gives to us a 35-page white paper. So I read it. First 7 pages, totally totally agree with it, right? First 7 pages, he's laying out the issues of the imperative of education reform, the fact that we are in a troubling circumstance, the fact that children from minority and poor neighborhoods are having all these problems. But then how, in page 8, does it turn so different? What is going on in terms of Romney's conclusions based on these facts that I think many reformers would agree about?
Well, what Mitt Romney was doing in D.C. and then later on in West Philadelphia was attempting to stake out some ground to the political right of President Obama when it comes to education. That's going to be a rather difficult task for him because except for school vouchers, which use taxpayer funds to subsidize private school tuition, both President Obama and Mr. Romney have embraced wholeheartedly the corporate education reform agenda, which was unleashed by No Child Left Behind in 2002. High-stakes tests to judge teachers in schools and charters as the solution for failing urban public schools.
Right, and we're going to touch on each of these, and because we're going to really take some time this morning. But Lala, I also want to ask very specifically. I heard you say we are asking the wrong questions, that part of what happens with this kind of charterization or privatization is that we're just asking the wrong questions. What are the right questions to be asking about our system of education and its need for reform?
There are a lot of them. I think that we need to start by saying, how can we surround young people with the support they need to be prepared to enter into our democracy? And I didn't hear anything in this report that answered or touched on that. It feels like the conversation we're having is happening in polarities and really in theoretical polarities. But when you look through that report and you try to find real students living in high poverty cities and an answer for them, an educational answer for them, it's simply not there. So I guess another one of kind of the right questions is how can we have school choice that allows all of our young people, no matter what zip code they're born into, to have access to high-quality education.
Well, and I'm wondering if it isn't incompatible with school choice. So let me just back up a little bit. As we were talking about the history question here, the question of Irish immigrants being part of founding the massive Catholic school system in this country. And in the case of the U.S. South, you can look very clearly in city after city. After the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education decision, there's massive disinvestment in the public schools by not only white families that move their kids into the private system, but also by the state and city and locality. They stopped building school buildings. They stopped. So as soon as you had choice, right, as soon as we integrated the schools as a matter of law, the choice operated to segregate schools and to limit the quality of schools for those who were left behind in the public system. Is that what would be reproduced in this case with more choice?
I think that part of the issue here is on both sides of the choice conversation is this either or notion of what it is that will reform schools. So this idea of sort of with less money in a time of financial crises, is choice going to somehow miraculously require less money if we only find the right group to be running our schools, whether that's private or public? And so it feels like the answer has to include saying, what's the partnership between public and private in solving a tremendous problem in a time of little resource? And that just doesn't seem to be entering into the debate.
I think the issue of asking the right questions, which you mentioned, is crucial. As you said, there is incredible disinvestment in public education right now. States like Pennsylvania, where I live, and New York and throughout the country are making enormous cuts to their public school budgets. And while some charters do a fantastic job educating children, the research is pretty clear that as a whole they do not outperform and sometimes pretty significantly underperform traditional public schools. So while the charter movement and the education reform movement has not been an academic success, they have had an incredible political achievement, which has been changing the terms of the debate, changing the questions being asked from the core issues, which are funding inequity. Like you said, segregation is still an enormous issue. A poor district like Philadelphia spends about $13 per year per pupil on students, while wealthy and overwhelmingly white Lower Merion, just across the city line, spends $26,000 per year.
Let me pause you right there, because one of the things that I kept reading reading in this Romney report was the idea of we spend plenty of money, right? So in Romney's white pages, he keeps saying, look, we spend plenty of money. We spend more per pupil than many of these other countries that are outperforming us. The issue is not money, and liberals just want to throw money at the problem, but money is not the problem. Is that right? Is that wrong?
Well, I mean, the point that he makes, which is we have spent money poorly in the educational space through the years, is a fair point to make. But the conclusion he then goes to is, so we don't need money to solve these problems.
Right.
And right up.
So what's one of the ways we've spent money poorly?
A perfect example would be No Child Left Behind, where more educational dollars were flowing into high-need schools than ever before, except they weren't actually getting to students. They were getting to testing companies to prepare students for tests. So if you looked at the budget of a school, you would say, oh, look, we're investing a lot more in schools. If you looked at an individual student and the dollars that followed that student to bring them to excellence and to being competitive in our world, absolutely not.
Right, so we're determining it by saying, okay, we're sending money to this school. This school has so many students, so this is the amount per pupil. But what we're spending it on is everything from test prep, which is going to enrich private corporations, to metal detectors, security guards, right?
The Title I, the whole idea of Title I money following students, which is the high poverty dollars, is such an interesting one. Because if you look at school choice and how it plays out in reality on the ground, there are certainly students who are getting a better education because of it. And then there are bereft neighborhood schools that have fewer resources than they've ever had, that have less experienced teachers, often less experienced principals, higher mobility rates, with fewer dollars within them. And the dollars left now have to make the school as safe as they possibly can. They're not getting to academic issues with those dollars, and there are fewer dollars.
Well, so we're going to come right back, because I really want to pick up on the charter schools point that you were just making, but we're going to bring an advocate of charter schools to the table so that we can have a broader conversation. And we're going to ask whether or not charter schools are the answer, or whether or not they're destroying the public in public schools. And in Philadelphia, a plan to close dozens of public schools and privatize the rest. You are not going to believe what some school districts are trying. That's all after the break.